This video we are going to talk about what led up to our daughter Krista being placed on hospice care, the spiritual struggles we went through as a couple during that time, and then the night she passed away. So let's just talk a little bit about what led up to her being on hospice care. And if you don't know, my daughter suffered shaken baby syndrome when she was 3 months old. She survived it and had many very severe disabilities after that. And her prognosis was they had no idea how long she would live or, what would happen. The only thing they could say was she would probably get an infection and pass away eventually because of her GI tract being, messed up from the initial brain injury. And what was the other prognosis? That she would just outgrow this small piece of brain that still worked after she was shaken. So she had very extensive brain damage. So she lived for about 3.5 years and was eventually placed on hospice care, which was a huge blessing because I had been trying to get her things like pain medication, but the state we lived in, which was Tennessee, was so strict about anyone having opioids and stuff like that because of the crisis that I guess a bunch of adults struggled with, which always frustrated me because children should still have access to medication even though adults make choices to abuse the medication, but we didn't have that. And so when she was placed on hospice care, she finally had that access to pain medication, which drastically changed a lot of things. It would have been a lot different without that. So do you want to kind of talk about what led up to the hospice care, like the things we noticed and stuff?
So kind of, yeah. I know that back in, was it that January? Because she went on hospice in October.
And this was in the year of 2020.
Right. But in January 2020, she was put in the hospital for like it was
a really bad respiratory infection.
Yeah, a respiratory infection. And so
they couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't RSV, things like that.
Right.
But she had a terrible respiratory infection.
Yeah. Anyways, so come October, she went back to the hospital and they checked her out. And they found out that there was fluid in her lungs, and that pretty much what they were thinking was that back in January her lungs had just never fully healed, and that even though she got better, her lungs continued to deteriorate because of the fluid in them and how they were operating, and because of her other injuries which weren't helping to heal her lungs.
And she would have a temperature that would drop down into the 80s.
Yeah.
Which most doctors would say, well, that's not like compatible with life. You can't survive like that. But her body would do that, and that was signs of, her coming to end of life. All those things together.
Right.
So when they finally figured out, okay, these things are all working together, the fluid in the lungs, the low temperature, things like that, they realized that she was in the end stages and they needed to actually place her on hospice care, which she couldn't get before because they had no idea when she would pass away, and she had no signs of end of life, the need for end of life care, even though she struggled so much. So she was finally placed on hospice care, and we went through a lot in our marriage during that time. We had a lot of spiritual attacks and spiritual struggles during that time with temptations and things like that. And so going through all of that all at once was definitely a struggle. But she was on hospice care for about 2 weeks. So during that time, just from a parent's perspective, what was that time like for you?
It was really odd in a sense because you're kind of just trying to push everything to the side just in case.
You still have to work, we still have jobs, things like that.
But then at the same time, you want to push it to the side.
Yeah,
because
you don't want to do anything else.
Work doesn't mean as much. You want to be there in case something happens. And every little thing that pops up with Krista at that time seemed to be like, okay, well, it means a lot. It means a lot more now. Mm-hmm. We have to put more focus on it now, and that sounds kind of bad, but if there were certain little things happening with Krista before, we might not have put so much focus on her. That's she does it every once in a while, but at that end of life stage,
everything
there was more focus put on that stuff.
And it was like, is this it? Is this it? Is she passing away right now?
Right. And finally, we did get to the point where, you know, she had some stuff that she was doing. She would just randomly stop breathing, right?
Yes.
Like she would hold her breath is what we thought she was doing.
She was placed on oxygen, which she didn't usually require, just for comfort measures. And so she would just go through these times of like holding her breath for a long time. And it looked like almost like when you cry really hard and you're holding your breath while you're crying. It's what it looked like. And so we realized later that it was most likely the oxygen. It was most likely her kind of trying to transition into passing away, but the oxygen kept like kicking her back into breathing instead of just allowing her to go. And so after we sent some videos of that to some people that we knew who worked in hospice care and had experience with children and things, they, you know, told us about how the scenario with the oxygen could actually prolong life even if she's trying to go. And so during that time, it was just hard to leave the house. It was, you know, you still have to live a normal life, even though it's everything but normal, because your child could pass away at any moment. But they also still didn't have a prognosis of time. They were like, well, we still can't pinpoint an exact time for this. So it was just a struggle to leave the house. We were going through things together, but we really needed each other also at the same time. So I was having to really rely on him for everything to help keep me, you know, mentally okay, and to help with our older daughter, because we also had an older daughter who ended up going on vacation with a friend at the exact, you know, perfect timing so that she wouldn't be there as Krista actually passed away. So anyways, through all that hospice care, it lasted about 2 weeks. So we had people coming in and out, and after about that 2-week mark, they could tell something was changing with her. And the way that they noticed that was, you know, the circulation in her feet seemed to be getting weaker, and her breathing was changing. Her respirations were, you know, farther apart. Her O2 levels kept dropping. None of that was ever normal for her. And so those were the signs that we noticed with her in her specific situation, that it was probably, you know, near time. But even then, you don't want to believe it. Like, I still was struggling with believing that it was actually going to happen, because she had had so many close calls in the past throughout her life and she didn't actually pass away from. So it was hard mentally to believe this was actually the end. And leading up, the few nights before she passed away, I spent a lot of time in her room with her, praying over her, you know, talking to her, even though, you know, by textbook, she shouldn't understand anything I say. But would just talk to her and tell her how much I loved her, and she changed my life, and how, you know, it was okay to go, and things like that. And so, and just a lot of talking to God, asking, because in those moments, all I had was God. It wouldn't have mattered how much money I had. It wouldn't have mattered, you know, nothing else outside of her and God and, you know, our family mattered in those moments. So I'm trying not to make this too long of a video. But so getting through the spiritual struggles together, we really had to push what we were going through aside and just cling to each other, because God gave us our marriage and each other for that moment. And so no matter what we were going through, we had to make the decision, and it's a decision, a personal decision that you make, to push aside, you know, any selfish feelings that you have or motives or whatever, and choose to, you know, just to choose each other instead of the struggle that you're going through. And so we had to choose each other, even though we were upset with each other. I was upset with him for some things. And so to allow him to be there for me. And sometimes when you're going through such intense sorrow and anguish and grief, you have to really open up yourself to allow someone to actually be there for you. Because it could be easy to just push everyone away and say, I don't want anyone around, I don't want to talk to nobody, you know, I want to be alone. But you have to really open up yourself to allow people to be there for you. So we were going to go into the night she actually passed away, but since this is getting kind of long, we'll probably make that a second video. So outside of this video, we're going to make another one talking about what it was actually like that night that she passed away, what she went through, what we went through, the signs that we noticed that she was actually starting to pass away and things like that. So do you have anything else to say about like the hospice care, the struggles we went through, things like that? Because, you know, the devil can see that this is a very, you know, intense, difficult moment of weakness when you're going through something like losing a child or, you know, anything difficult. The devil is going to try to do every little thing to slip his way in there and to really get you when you're down, to kick you when you're down, and to really try to make you turn away from God through the situation instead of turning to him. And it's a choice that you have to make, to turn to God instead of walking away and saying, this is too much, why would God do this to me? You know, all those things that go through your mind of how could a good God allow this to happen? You know, the devil's gonna be whispering in your ear the whole time, you know, all these things. And it's even more, you know, it's a even more intense struggle whenever you have all these other things mentally going on. And so it's always a struggle to, you know, resist temptation and to, you know, not turn and listen to the devil whenever he's trying to get you to, you know, have a negative mindset towards things or be upset or angry at God. That can be a struggle, but especially when you're going through something, you know, such as grief and sorrow and things like that. And so, do you have anything to say about that? Like how, do you remember anything about like how we got through that and how?
I mean, the biggest part is just realizing that you need people in those moments. Like, you have to have moments by yourself, but you also at the same time need people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just like, you know, you had, after she passed, well, even before she passed, knowing that she was passing, like she said, she went in and had days or a couple nights before, so she would go in there and she'd just spend hours in Krista's room with Krista while everybody else was sleeping. And she needed that. And then there were times that she didn't want to be alone. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's just one of those things where you need other people around, or at least at arm's length in case you need them.
Yeah. And even if you're upset, I was mad at him for some things that we were going through. And so I was so angry at him, but at the same time, I knew deep down that God had given him to me for that moment. Yeah. And that God had that planned long before we even knew that she was going to be passing away. And so, because I had that relationship with God, he is the one, you know, it wasn't in my strength at all. It was completely in God's strength. He was the one who gave me the strength to still be able to communicate with Canyon and to, you know, lean on him when I needed him, because I couldn't have done it in my own strength. And I couldn't have made it through any of that in my own strength. It was all God. There was, you know, I always have people talk about, you have to give yourself credit and stuff for what you went through, and, you know, you're the one who did this and that. But yes, I had to make the decision to trust God and to allow God to give me the strength, but it was not my strength at all. If I had relied on my own strength, I probably would have been suicidal during the time, because going through something so intense and so, like, I wanted to die with her in my own strength. I just wanted to go and die with her. It would have, to me, that would have been easier than facing the grief and the intense sorrow and the deep anguish. And so there was no way I could have done it in my own strength. It wasn't my strength at all. It was fully God's strength, and it was fully him giving me grace and allowing me to give myself grace and space, and to give Canyon grace and to give Canyon forgiveness, and to be able to just, you know, move forward and not just want to lay around and die the entire time, because that's how it physically felt. It physically felt like I was dying myself because it hurt so badly. So yeah, so that was basically, I'm sure there's actually more things that we didn't mention, but that was what it was like to go through the hospice care process. I wish there was more for children in our specific state, which was Tennessee, to, you know, she was not much different through her entire life, other than that temperature change and the fluid on the lungs. And so she should have had access to things like pain medication her entire 3 years. But she only had it towards the end of her life, which I'm very thankful for, because without that, it would have been extremely painful and horrible. But she should have had access to that the entire time. She shouldn't have had to suffer for adults making certain decisions. And, you know, with addiction and all that, like, why I am still frustrated with the fact that she had to suffer because of adults making decisions to abuse drugs. And so, you know, I wish those things would change. I wish she could have been placed on something like hospice care. I know they have palliative care, but the only option we had was to drive 2.5, 3 hours there and back to receive palliative care. And she had a dislocated hip and all these things. She couldn't even hardly ride for 30 minutes in a car. So we really didn't have access to these things. And telehealth didn't work because there's so many strict rules around opioids and stuff like that, that you can't do things like that on telehealth. They have to be seen so many times in person. And so to this day, I still wish that she could have been on hospice care either a longer amount of time right after she was injured, so she would have had access to things that she had access to on hospice care, but not in her normal everyday life. Even though she was the same, she couldn't do anything. She had a lot of pain. She lived in pain constantly. I had days where I was just crying. I couldn't handle anymore just watching her in pain. I would have to leave my house and leave her with a nurse or ask someone to come watch her so that I could just get away from seeing her in pain all the time. And so anyways, that's another video too, but we'll go ahead and end this video. So the next video, we're going to talk about, you know, the day that she passed away, the signs, symptoms, you know, things that we noticed to know that she was getting closer to the actual end of her life, and, you know, how we got through that. So we'll see you on the next video.